He's coming after me, and I just ran into my van and locked the door. Kind of as the door was closing, I was hitting that lock button. He punched my driver's side window.
Hey gang, if you're listening to this right now, odds are you watch videos on the main channel and you've seen how important speed and accuracy are in a gunfight. That's why Active Self-Protection recommends the Range Tech Shot Timer. It's the lowest cost shot timer on the market that we're aware of, Bluetooth compatible with any Android or iOS device, more features than any other shot timer. You can store all your data on the cloud for free, native integration with Practice Score, and a visual light-based go signal. Visit them at rangetechtimer.com and tell them your friends at the Active Self-Protection Podcast sent you. Alrighty gang, welcome back to the Active Self-Protection Podcast. I am your host, Mike Williver, and I am your favorite former Fed. With us today, a new friend of mine. Her name is Kendra Hook. She hails from originally from California. Boo! But now she lives in northern Arizona. Yay! She is a single mom of one rambunctious boy, and she is a patient care technician at a local healthcare facility. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Kendra, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So she's hiding. You folks, you should know this. It's not a video podcast. You can't tell. She's hiding in her car from her kid, who is she? There's no way she could do this in the same room with that rambunctious 5-year-old. So she's hiding in the car. She has an eye on him, though, folks. It's okay. Nobody calls CPS. Kendra's doing a fine job. So, talk to us about your childhood. It's interesting because the person with whom you had a dispute and an incident was a close family member. So it's kind of a weird question in this case. But did you grow up? You grew up in the LA area, or no? Is that where you just came from more recently?
I did grow up in the LA area, San Fernando Valley, to be a little more specific. And yes, the person that was involved that I found myself defending myself from was someone that I did grow up with very closely in the home.
Okay. Did you at any point between childhood and now, prior to this incident, give self-defense a lot of thought? Were you a watcher of the channel? Had you taken any firearms classes or self-defense or anything like that?
Yes, sort of.
Okay.
So I grew up with firearms in the home. My dad had a revolver and a couple of hunting rifles. Mm-hmm. And so I learned very young that guns were not scary. My brother and I were raised with the universal gun safety rules. My brother and I actually both took martial arts for a very, very short time in like junior high and high school. And so it was always something that we were aware of, but we didn't necessarily have a ton of practice in it. And it wasn't... It's not something we ate, slept, and breathed necessarily. We were just really aware that it was super important.
I got you. All right, perfect. Talk to me really quick about your job. My sister works at a hospital out in the Maryland area. So what exactly is a patient care tech, and what is it you do when you're on the job?
A patient care tech does the same work as a CNA, a certified nurse assistant. A CNA went to school for the work, whereas a patient care tech like myself was trained on the job. I do have a background in surgical technology, so used to assist in surgery. So it wasn't the worst thing in the world for me to kind of transfer over into that area and that side of patient care.
So not a big leap.
Yeah, not a huge leap.
I gotcha.
So I work on the med-surg floors as well as, which is just kind of where you get admitted. If you go into the ER and they want to hang on to you for a little bit and observe you and maybe provide some intervention, I usually work on the med-surg floors, but I have been floated over to the emergency department, psych, as well as ICU.
So you've seen a few things in your time, I'd imagine.
A few, yeah.
Yeah. The stories I hear from my sister are absolutely insane. And, having been in a bunch of emergency rooms in a law enforcement context. So yeah, I have some idea of what that's like. So let's
Yes.
discuss your incident. You wrote to me and talked about it, and you weren't even writing to be on the show. You were just writing to say thank you to the folks, the good people at Active Self Protection, for kind of giving you a little bit of information, maybe a little bit of advantage and awareness during the incident that maybe helped you. So talk to us about what happened. I know it can't be easy to talk about, but talk to us about what happened and about how long ago it was, and just kind of walk us through that.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, after it all happened, I decided to write in. I kind of did a little decompression with my uncle on the phone, Uncle Bob. But I decided to write into you guys to say, hey, you really made a huge difference. It could have gone a lot different, but it didn't. And this was actually pretty recently. It was only about a month and a half ago on September 15th.
Mm-hmm.
And I work the night shifts. I work 6 p.m. to 6:30 a.m. It sucks.
Yeah, I know.
So I find myself chasing sleep a lot. I'm usually really, really tired. I had worked the night before. So I got up in the afternoon. I picked my son up from school and we stayed home for a bit. And, I just remembered I had some errands to run. So we got in the car and about 2 blocks down the road, I realized I walked out of the house without any of my tools. I do have a firearm, a couple. I do carry knives. I carry like a Kubotan, it's pepper spray. I use palm pepper spray, actually.
A little something for everybody is what you're carrying, basically.
A little something for everybody. Right. A few little, a few things going on. So right. I realized I had walked out without any of my tools. And after binge watching Active Self Protection for about the last year and a half, maybe 2 years, it's been something that I've learned is just so very important. And they're so easy to carry. It's silly not to, is how I personally feel about it for me and for the people around me. And so I realized I was like, I left without any of my tools. And I thought, you know what? I was just so tired. I was like, I'm not going back. I'm sure, everything's going to be fine. Nothing's going to happen. I'll just make sure I'm really, really aware. And I'm driving down the road and I get to a stop sign and I'm getting ready to make a turn. And I see a gentleman that is broken down on the side of the road. He's driving a large truck and he's towing like an RV, a fifth wheel, something like that. Mm-hmm. And and I'm one to like stop and help if I'm able to, if I feel safe to do so. I am not a mechanic, so I noticed he had a phone. That is really all I could do to help in that situation. So seeing that he had a phone and he had access to help, I kept going. Got my errands done, came back and getting ready to make that turn back home. And I noticed that there was another person out helping him, trying to figure out what was wrong with his vehicle. And I remember thinking, that's so cool. I'm so glad someone stopped to help him. And I made the turn and I noticed actually it was my dad. My dad's truck pulled over on the side of the road. I was like, oh, that was my dad. Okay. And I had remembered, I got this sinking feeling. I had talked to my dad the night before on the phone. And he had been drinking very, very heavily. It was his birthday. I had called to wish him happy birthday. And he was not happy about turning another year older. And it's we were raised in an alcoholic home. One parent, my dad has pretty much always been an alcoholic. He was sober for several years and then he started back up again. And so I just had this sinking feeling because it was late at night when I was on the phone with him and I knew that he was either hungover or he was still drinking. And I was concerned for his safety. I was, wasn't real sure like how his interaction with this other gentleman, a stranger, was going. And I just had this feeling I had to stop and check it out. Mm-hmm. And so I pulled over and I got out And I said, "Hey, Dad." And he goes, "Hey." And the minute I saw him, the minute he started talking, I knew that he was just trashed.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, okay. Um, and I don't, my dad and I didn't have a relationship for a long time because of his drinking. I don't like to interact with him when he's in that state.
Sure.
And so I was like, all right, well, I got to get back home. And I turned and I just kind of bailed. I got out of there and I got about 2 blocks and I still had this sinking feeling, this gut feeling. It was just bad. It was just bad. And so I realized his truck was facing like he was going out, not like he was coming in. And I immediately like I immediately thought, my working in the medical field, I see terrible accidents. I see all kinds of stuff. And anyone that's in any kind of, whether it's first responder or some kind of responder, we see some really terrible things. And I felt incredibly uncomfortable letting someone drive while they were under the influence, knowing they could potentially hurt themselves or others,
Sure.
up to and including death. And I just went, and so I turned around and I went back and my dad and this gentleman's exchange was done. And I put my arms around him, kind of like his shoulders. And I said, "Hey, have you been drinking, Dad?" He goes, "Yeah, I have." I'm like, "Okay." I was like, "Why don't you get in my van? I'll take you home." And he had his dog in the truck with him and everything. And I was like, "I'll take you and the dog home and I'll get your truck back." And immediately he got incredibly angry and he goes, "No." I went, "Ooh, okay." And and I'm like, "Look, it's not safe for you to be driving while you're drinking. It's not safe for anyone. I'm not okay with it. You go ahead." I was like, "Look," I'm like, "Okay, where are you wanting to go?" And he was like, "Oh, I need cigarettes." I'm like, "Cool. I'll take you to get cigarettes, no problem."
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, "I just want you to be safe. I want everyone else to be safe. Go ahead and get in my van." And he goes, "No, I'm not going with you." And his tone instantaneously was what I remembered as a kid.
Mm.
And it was not, there are not happy memories there for a lot of that.
Sure.
So, and I was like, "Look, uh, this is, I'm not giving you an option. You can't be out like this. You need to get in so that I can get you home safe. This is not a discussion that we're having. I'm telling you what needs to happen right now."
Mm-hmm.
And then the yelling and the screaming and the cussing and the name calling started. And so I quickly walked over to his truck. I grabbed his keys and I showed him that I had his keys. So he wasn't worrying where his keys were. And I was like, "Hey, I have your keys. You need to figure it out then, because
Mm-hmm.
you're not driving."
Right.
And so suddenly he was able to walk just fine again. And he took off and he came after me. And it did surprise me. I looked back and the only way I can describe it, it's hard to say, like, because this is my dad, right? So it's hard to relay knowing so many people are going to hear this, but I do think it's important. The amount of hatred he had for me in his eyes was incredibly unnerving, and it's not something that I've ever seen before.
Okay, that was going to be my next question. Has he accosted you like that before, and had he acted this specific way previously, or was this all new to you?
Not this severely.
Okay.
I'd never seen him hate me like that before. He never, he would, when I was little, he would square up to me and flinch just to make me flinch. He was very much into like intimidation and control. So he used to do what he could to let me think that he was going to come after me, but he never actually did. Not like that. So this was a whole other level.
Okay.
This was a whole other level.
As he's running towards you, is he saying anything? Do you remember?
"Give me my keys." Cussing, name calling, all the things that we would have to bleep out.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So what did you do in response?
In front of
Obviously,
my son.
yeah,
In front of my son.
that is the worst. Let me just
Yeah.
throw in something for our audience here. I grew up in a household with a very, very abusive alcoholic mother, and it took me a long time to forgive her. She's passed away. A long time to forgive her for all the things that went down with me and my older brothers, especially. But the things that we had to see as kids was unbelievable and unacceptable. So I do commend you for being willing to come on and talk about this, because there is at least one person who's going to hear this show and they're going to go, okay, it's not just me. I'm not the only one that's been through this. That's happened more than once with other episodes. So I really appreciate you coming on. So he is coming after you. What did you do in response?
He's coming after me, and I just ran into my van and locked the door. Kind of as the door was closing, I was hitting that lock button, and he got to the door, and he's yelling and screaming and name calling still, and he's pointing at me and he's saying, give me my keys, and I just ignored him. He punched my driver's side window. And, I don't want to make this sound more dramatic than it was. Like, this wasn't like some big wind up that he had on him, but it was hard enough that I thought, is this going to break? Is it going to crack? What, it stopped me for a second, but he punched my window. He backhanded my windshield and flipped me off. And then he was just standing there, like, staring me down. And it's something I recognized from the last 42 years of my life.
Mm-hmm.
That's his thing, is an attempt at fear and intimidation. And he's usually pretty successful at it. And it did rattle me. It did. And I hate that it did. But I mean, it's true. It did.
Sure.
It took me a minute to figure out what phone number to dial. And I had a big old surge of adrenaline, because it's not just me. My little boy was with me.
Sure.
And I knew that he was seeing his papa act like this towards his mom. And I did not, I didn't want him to see that. I didn't want him to have this memory. And it sucked.
Yeah.
Sorry, it sucked.
No, that's fine.
So anyway, the other thing that I really hate about my reaction is that the first person I called actually was my mom. And I called and I was thinking, like, okay, are there any tricks that she has up her sleeve for trying to calm him down? Because when my brother and I were growing up, of course, she's the one that had to deal with him on this level, not us. And so, I called her. I was like, do you have any tricks up your sleeve for this? And she goes, nope. And I'm like, if you don't, I'm calling the cops. She goes, call them. And wow. I thought, crap. And again, if I'm really being honest, I wasn't just calling to de-escalate. I was calling for permission. I'm a 42-year-old woman, grown woman, who's raising another human being. And I called to ask for permission because no one ever called the cops on him. We just dealt with his anger. I'm kind of getting fired up about it. We dealt with his crap because eventually it would stop. And we just crossed our fingers every single time because we thought, well, hopefully it stops this time too. And I started standing up for myself with him when I was about 11 years old. And every single time that I did, it had to be measured. And I always thought he was just going to beat the living out of me.
What was your dad like when he's not drinking?
Huh?
What is he like when he's not drinking?
Not dissimilar.
Mm-hmm. But under control.
I remember thinking, again, he was sober for quite a few years, and like a decade plus maybe. And I remember thinking, wow, he's a huge jerk when he's sober too.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I think most people expect the answer to be, oh, he's a total sweetheart, when he's not drinking, but not the case with your dad. Okay, fair enough.
He's a sweetheart for longer when he's not drinking,
Mm.
but he's got a temper. He's got his, I mean, quite honestly, he's got his own past traumas that are totally unprocessed.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
that he lives in.
Yeah, I
So
was going to say that's almost certainly always the case, with someone who has a substance abuse problem and a is an angry person for no apparent reason all the time. It's almost always a learned behavior. The alcoholism
yeah,
might not be a learned behavior. That's more likely just a genetic thing that people either have it or they don't. But the other stuff was learned.
yeah,
None of that makes it okay. His past trauma is his past trauma. So it doesn't make it okay for him to treat anyone that way, least of all his kids, and least of all for his little 5-year-old grandbaby to see what happens. So I want you to know that I heard everything you just said, and I want you to know that I'm proud of you, first of all, for recognizing the permission thing. That's something I realized at about your age, so for me about 10 years ago, where somebody goes, why are you asking this question, about a thing? And I said, well, I don't know. They're like, you're a grown man, make your own decision. So good for you for recognizing that and saying it out loud.
The part that adds like another layer of awkwardness is my dad is my neighbor. He lives in the apartment right next to me. Our
Oh
living
boy.
room share a wall. And I'm sitting in my car outside, and he just walked out, so I had to roll up my window because obviously I have not shared with him that I'm doing this.
Sure.
He may
Okay.
eventually hear it. Who knows? So
Yeah, who knows?
sorry.
So just
There's
back.
another layer of weird.
Yeah, no kidding. I didn't know that. That's unfortunate. We'll come back to that in a few minutes, I think. So it's this
Okay.
point in the story. He's at the window. He's yelling. He's screaming. He's backhanding your windshield.
Mm-hmm.
So you eventually did call the police. Did it occur to you to leave
I did
and then call the police, or how did that go down?
It did occur to me, and I thought, like, I need to get out of here. But my other concern was he was totally enraged, and I thought, like, what is he gonna do? Is he gonna take off, like, walking down this stretch of road? It's a 2-lane road, and it kind of cuts through the middle of town, and there's a good at least couple 3 miles where there are no stop signs, no signals. So traffic tends to be faster than what law enforcement would suggest.
Right. Yeah. Gotcha.
And so I was concerned about him, and it's interesting, like, even though he's coming at me like this, and it's clearly wildly inappropriate, to say the least, I'm still where he's my dad. I don't want anyone to get hurt. I just don't. It doesn't matter what they're doing. I just don't want anyone to get hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was concerned that he would start walking somewhere clearly not in a healthy frame of mind and really get hurt. So I stayed to keep an eye on him.
So you called 911. You tell the police what's happening. Is he still banging on your window as you're talking to the dispatcher?
At that point, he is staring me down. He's standing right at my driver's side window. He's staring me down, and he's saying, go ahead, call him. And I'm ignoring him, or I'm at least trying to look like I'm ignoring him. I'm extremely aware of what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point he walked, was parked behind his truck. He walked back to his truck, and he lit up what was one of his last cigarettes in the pack. And the dispatcher, she was wonderful. And she said, I want you to tell me everything that he's doing as it's happening. And I said, okay. And I told her, he just walked back to his truck. He lit up a cigarette. And she's like, okay, so I said, he's a few feet away from us. And she said, okay. And then he started walking back, and my son from his car seat yells, no, 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 which absolutely wrecked me. And I haven't heard the 911 tape yet. I'm still working on getting it, but I have a feeling she may have overheard that. And she said, okay, we're getting multiple units to you now. Something to that effect.
Right.
And she's like, what's going on? I said, he's walking back, and she can hear it. Well, you can hear me, trying to comfort my son. I'm like, don't worry, buddy. It's okay. Nothing. I'm not going to let anything happen. We're safe right here. And I'm thinking, as I'm saying that, I'm like, man, I better be able to back that up.
Absolutely.
That's a big moment for, such a young child to be in a scary situation, seeing some level of violence. I know that so many people and so many kids have seen so much more intense and so much quote unquote worse. But nonetheless, he's never seen anything like this. And I was hoping to skate by that in his childhood, but here we sit. Anyway, and I'm like, you know what? We're going to be okay. We're safe right here. He's not going to do anything. And I had made that decision at that time. Like, we always hear, on the channel, like, we have to make a decision. We have to make a decision. And I think that in any self-defense scenario, there's a series of points in the scenario where we have to make very clear decisions. And we kind of have that moment that's our go button. And that was one of those decisions I make. I'm hearing the fear in my son. It's now very, very real. I can't be in denial about it. If it escalates anymore, if he hits my window one more time, if he flinches at me one more time, that's now when I'm leaving.
Okay.
And so and I was like, don't worry, we'll be okay. Each other until the police were there, and I made sure I waited until one officer was completely out of his car before I opened my door. I wanted to make sure that there was that I had adequate backup.
Right.
You know what I mean? And at that point, it was 9 minutes.
Wow.
We're a small town, but stuff happens everywhere, and law enforcement's busy. So it was 9 minutes from the time I called 911 until the time that the units showed up.
Yeah, and that's an eternity when you're under stress in a situation like that. 2 minutes is an eternity. So,
yes.
Yeah, I can imagine 9 minutes seem like a very long time. So what do the police do once they get there?
They were wonderful. Another layer, I really hesitated on whether or not I was going to mention it, but my dad actually used to be a police officer.
Okay.
And so my brother and I were raised to be extremely respectful. Like, to us, the police are the cavalry. And, in every field, there are the excellent ones, the ones that are, it's kind of neutral, like they do the job. And then the ones that no one's sad when they leave. These guys were amazing. They were the cavalry. I was so glad to see them. When we got there, as soon as the first officer came out and took a couple steps away from his vehicle, my dad started walking up to him. Those are his brothers, right? And so I got out of my van and I waved, and I think there were a total of 5, maybe 6 officers that responded. And I remember initially being surprised. I was like, whoa, that's a lot. But when I realized that it wasn't just a drunk guy causing a ruckus, there was like a single mom with her 5-year-old that was scared and locked in a van.
Yep.
So they were nice and respectful to my dad. And I let them know, I was like, just so you guys know, one of the layers of something you're going to deal with him is he used to be an officer. And they asked me what department he used to work for. I told them. And I said, so this is going to be really, really hard for him. It's just a layer. Just be aware. And so they said, okay, thank you. And they just asked me, a series of questions. He was like, okay, what happened? And I let him know everything that I could. He asked me, he said, now, when you went to take the keys out of the ignition, he said, was the truck running? And I realized, I'm like, oh, I don't remember. And then I realized why he was asking. I went,
yep.
Okay. And he goes, and I'm like, it's okay. And I said, I didn't hear the truck running, but I had to turn the keys toward me in order to get them out of the ignition. So I'm pretty sure it was running.
And for those who don't know, the officer was trying to establish one of the elements of the crime of driving under the influence of alcohol. So that's why had the truck been parked, he and her dad made a statement saying he had been driving, they'd have nothing to go on as far as arresting him for that. So that's why he asked that question. So turns out you had to turn the key back to get the key out of the ignition. Therefore, it was either running or had been running.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So
and I realized why he was asking, and I just sank. I went, oh man. And I'm like, okay. And so again, here's this really interesting and terrible thing about essentially an abusive situation, a parent-child relationship of that nature, is this terrible thing is going on. And I'm still worried about protecting my dad because he's my dad. Right. And so he, the officer also asked, basically it was, I forgot exactly how he phrased it. He goes, how scared were you? And he's like, did you really think that he was going to like come after you and hurt you? And the way I'm saying it wasn't, he didn't say it in a demeaning way. He wanted to understand where I was at and what I was experiencing. And he's like, did you feel like he was really going to hurt you or your son? Or did you, did you just realize that he's really, really mad? And I said, I said he was pretty angry. And I said, I was pretty nervous. And I still was even I wanted to get my point across, but still edit. I didn't want to have like all these charges thrown at my dad, even though his decision, his consequences. Then that's one of the reasons I wrote into you and John is I'm like, you know what? There's no way that I'm the only one in this world, like you said, that's experiencing this. And it was a shock to me that I was still willing to protect him to a certain degree.
Yeah, that's fairly common in people in those kinds of relationships. That's part of the dysfunction in my history and in my opinion is that when my mom would get drunk and do really, really bad things, if the police got called, I'd be like, no, that's my mom. That's just sort of human nature. And the longer that relationship goes on and the longer that abusive part of the relationship goes on, the harder it gets to extricate yourself from it. So again, kudos to you for being willing to come on and discuss this. So did he end up getting arrested?
He did. He was arrested and charged with a DUI. His license is suspended. There is no relationship there anymore, even though he is my very close next door neighbor. And any information that I have about it since that day has been from my mom. And, I had to, the officers asked me if I was going to be willing to pick him up after they had processed him because they knew that they were going to release him. Like it's a small town here. So, they were going to release him in like an hour and a half. And I was like, oh yeah, I don't have a problem picking him up. And later on I thought it's just one more pieces of that dysfunction. And I'm like, yeah, there's no way he's going to pull anything with me after this. And he didn't physically, but there were some words exchanged, and we can talk more about that later if you want. But, but yeah, so he did get arrested on a DUI. His license is suspended. And from what I understand, I mean, if he hasn't already done it, there's a second hearing that he needs to go to.
Okay.
So
yeah. Let me ask you this. To the person out there listening right now who is maybe in somewhere along the abusive, dysfunctional family continuum, maybe they're not where you are yet, who's listening and wondering what they might do. What advice can you give someone who hasn't gotten to your point yet with a loved one, be it a parent, a child, a spouse, a boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever? What would you say to that person if they called you for advice right now?
Well, what would you do or say if it was your best friend or a significant other? and treat yourself, defend yourself the way you would defend a best friend.
I like it. So you had said earlier that at least in part, watching active self-protection kind of gave you a mindset. Could you talk just a little bit about what you mean by that? Because I'm sure people are kind of probably wondering exactly what it was you saw or heard that maybe prepared you and got you in a position where you reacted appropriately.
Oh, yeah. It's, you guys talk about it all the time on the channel. It's those mental reps, those mental repetitions. Nobody, like every single video, every single call, every single scenario, there's not one person that's expecting it. Sometimes the perpetrator isn't even expecting it. Mm-hmm. I'm quite confident my dad had no knowledge, no intention of coming at me like he was going to beat the living out of me in the middle of the street in front of my son. Mm-hmm. When he woke up that morning. Sometimes people do plan these things. I don't think that happened. Right. But the defender on each of these scenarios that you guys analyze and break down so well for us, none of them know that it's going to happen in that moment. Like you guys said, the bad guy, the planner, the whatever, he or she gets to say. They set the date and the time. Mm-hmm. We don't.
Right.
And so seeing that theme replay over and over, like I said, I binge watch you guys like crazy. I'm a single mom. I don't have ample time to run out and take a ton of self-defense classes. So I rely heavily on those mental reps and, we've heard a lot of people say that it sounds really paranoid. I think it's a type of preparedness going through life, going through daily life. What would I do if? What would I do when?
If this, then what?
Yeah, if this, then what? And going a step further, what are the contingencies? My plan might be this, but what if I can't access my firearm? What if I can't get to my knife in time?
Right.
What if someone goes for my child first? Guess what? I'm not going for a weapon. I'm going for my kid. And then I'm going to have to figure out what I'm going to do on the fly. So that's, those are the contingencies to plan for. Hearing people, hearing like this podcast is so phenomenal because you get to hear what was going on in the mind and of the person that was, being attacked in the mind of the defender. And you start to understand how the human brain works and how different people and different personalities, is it happening when someone is exhausted and having just gotten off of a night shift a few hours before? Is it happening late at night when someone's waking up at 3:00 in the morning, someone beating down their door? Mm-hmm. Are they wide awake? Are they bright-eyed and bushy-tailed? Have they just had a cup of coffee? And you get to have all these scenarios and take in all these mental reps and just hearing different people's stories. I can honestly say that every scenario, especially like hearing people on the podcast, every person's self-defense, self-protection encounter has played a part in my preparedness of how I protect and defend myself and my son and anybody else that's around us, down to what I carry, how I carry, and when. It's a really long answer, but I hope that clears that up.
That's why there's no time limit on this show. There is on Gutowski because he'll talk all day, but for the guests, there's no time limit. Now, before we hit the record button earlier, you said you had some notes. I want to give you a moment here to just check those notes and make sure there's nothing that you wanted to talk about that we left out, because this week is the busiest week I've had since we started the podcast as far as interviews goes. I've got a whole bunch lined up, and I got one lined up in about 15 minutes. So yeah, there is a time limit actually. Let me take that back.
When I was writing you and John, I thought to myself, I feel like there are just a couple aspects to the story that are pretty unique. One, I have known the person that came after me for 42 years.
Right.
You know, also and it's something that cannot be said enough. I did not have any of my tools on me. Nothing. I had my keys and that was it. And this thing that is not something that I would have seen coming from a mile away on that day happened the one time I did not have my tools with me.
Right.
Guys, for everyone that's listening, bring your dang tools with you everywhere you go. And I remembered it 2 blocks down the road, and I made a conscious decision to not turn around because, quote unquote, everything would probably be fine.
Mm-hmm.
And much to my surprise and chagrin, it was not. Now, and then I thought, what would I have used at that time? I would have doused him with Palm so fast.
Mm-hmm.
However, the concerning part about that is, while that was, I'm like, what is that phrase you guys use? Like the Monday morning quarterback?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
I'm Monday morning quarterbacking myself now. Shout out to all the overthinkers out there. You're in good company. While this whole thing was going on, he came after me and he swiped at me. He physically tried to grab me.
Mm-hmm.
As far as I remember, he physically tried to grab me. Not once in this entire encounter did I ever think, man, I wish I had my tools. I wish I had my OC spray. I wish I had my this or my that. Not once did I ever even think about my tools. Why? Because while this was a whole other level than I'd ever experienced with him before, it was still along the same vein of what I grew up with. And it is, I think it is a really messed up type of normalcy bias, which is another term like that, you hear on the channel a lot.
Yeah, and I guess the question then, Kendra, is what's normal? What's normal to someone who's been conditioned to be around this there since they were born? So your normal is not anyone else's normal. I was in rough shape a few years ago. I went to see my doctor, my GP, and she goes, "How do you feel?" And I said, "I feel pretty good." And I'll bleep this out myself. She goes, "No, you feel like shit, and you just don't know it because you feel like it all the time, every day, all day long." And she was right. I needed to make some changes. So that normalcy bias, what's normal for you may not be normal for anyone else, or not in a similar position to you. Kendra, that actually is our time. I hate to do it, but I have someone else to talk to in 9 minutes, so I got to let you go. This has been a wonderful discussion. I think this is a great, and I talked to John about this before we scheduled the interview, and he agreed, and Stephanie agreed. What a great episode, because this is applicable to so many more people than you probably think it is. This is a very, very common problem in families, and your willingness to come on and talk about it. I think the word bravery is tossed around a little bit too cavalierly in our time, but I think it was very brave of you to come on and almost certainly help someone else. And if I'm ever up in northern Arizona, I'll look you up, and
Please do.
and
Yes.
the lovely and fetching Mrs. Williver and I will join you for coffee or something. And
I love it.
All right,
love it.
Kendra Huck, thank you so much. Okay, gang, the main interview is over, and you know what that means. It's time once again for the Gutowski Files, starring Stephen Gutowski. He is the founder of TheReload.com and the host of the weekly Reload podcast, which you can find on all your finer podcast outlets and on YouTube. If you go to the YouTube channel, you subscribe to that, where you get full shows and you get snippets, so you can just look at, browse around and see what's interests you, and then check that out too. Stephen, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So you are from the Philadelphia area originally, and as
Correct.
of the recording of this, your Phillies are going into Game 3 tonight, or no, tomorrow?
Yeah.
No. Yeah.
Game 3.
And your Eagles are undefeated. And as a native of Washington D.C., I'm not happy about that, but I'm happy for you, my friend.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great time to be a Philly fan. I say that much. Although they are going to play at the same time on Thursday night, which is pretty annoying. I don't know why they can't move that game. If anyone from MLB is listening that schedules these things, please move the Phillies game up. to 5 o'clock.
And it's, as we were saying, it's Houston, Philly times 2 Thursday night. So this will be, if you're listening to this when it comes out, that'll be last night. So you'll know how these games ended up. But it's definitely an interesting decision. This week we are discussing the NRA's funding of $1.1 million in campaign ads in several swing states. This comes on the heels of last week's sit down with Stephen, where we talked about every town and their push into some state races and issues other than gun control. So I wonder if these two are related, but I'll let you talk about that, Stephen. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, these are dueling, ads that you're seeing out there among the gun groups, where they're going back and forth in a lot of the same races. The NRA in particular is focused almost exclusively on the Senate and some of the major battleground races in the Senate. That's going to determine, which party holds control of that house of Congress. And they're spending in 6 different races: Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada, North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona, where you are out there in Arizona. And so that's where they're really focused a lot of their money. And the NRA's strategy has also been a bit different from the gun control groups in a couple of ways. They're both spending a lot of money. The NRA is still outpacing the gun control groups. Everytown, Giffords, and Brady combined is still a little bit less than what the NRA is spending. Well, the NRA is really the only pro-gun group that is spending significant amounts of money in this election,
right?
And that's pretty much always the case. This is something we've gone back and talked about this in the past, of how a lot of people write off the NRA because of the corruption issues, and or they don't like their policy positions or whatever, and they think they don't matter anymore, but they really do still matter quite a lot.
Yeah, agreed.
On the program side of things, they're really the only ones spending big money in elections. NSSF, the industry's trade group, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, they spend money, but they've raised about $800,000 this cycle, whereas the NRA is at $17 million. So that gives you a good idea. And NSSF is really the next biggest group on the program side. But anyway, so you're seeing some differences in strategy, though, between the pro-gun side and the pro-gun control side, where the gun control groups, as we talked about last week, have sort of expanded out their message and the kinds of races that they're spending money in. To really go into areas that aren't even gun related necessarily. Those state secretary races we talked about last time have really nothing to do with gun policy in particular. And they also have expanded their messaging to include, in a lot of cases, abortion, which they argue is connected to guns in some way, but is really just is sort of this intersectional approach to the campaign season. Whereas the NRA has stayed much more focused on gun policy. They have incorporated a crime message into a lot of their ads. They've been doing that for a long time, right? Although usually it's more directly related to gun ownership, talking about how people could be a victim of crimes if they aren't armed. Whereas I think this election, it's a little bit more on the problem of crime generally, and then combining that with guns, so it's a little bit less connected directly. People should judge for themselves. You should go watch. You can watch the ads. We have them. We have quotes from the ads in our piece on this. So I don't want to prejudge anyone in that regard. So you can watch them yourself. Here's a quote from one. This is in the Senate race in Pennsylvania. The NRA ad goes, quote, "A man brutally killed in downtown Pittsburgh, stabbed to death with gardening shears. His murderer convicted to a life sentence until John Fetterman voted to set him free. Fetterman then wanted to release nearly 1,200 murderers." And then it turns to guns and says, quote, "Fetterman wants to take away your fundamental right to defend yourself and your family while opening jail cells for violent criminals. Rated by the NRA, Fetterman supports unconstitutional red flag gun confiscation laws and banning the most common semi-automatic firearms and magazines in Pennsylvania. That's why Pennsylvania gun owners support Dr. Oz." So there's an example of an ad and how they approach the crime and guns issue and how they connect them. But that's pretty typical for a lot of their other ads as well. We have a bunch of them quoted here. A lot of them haven't been reported on elsewhere, but so if you want to see what the NRA is is doing in these races and where they're spending money and what their message is, you should head over and check out some of these ads directly.
Yeah, and another point in the article, which I thought was almost as important, if not more important than this sort of temporal issue of this campaign ad funding is, and I think Jake wrote this one. Yeah, Jake Fogelman wrote this article, and I think he talks about the idea of the influence and the sway the NRA will have moving forward. And this is kind of maybe a bit of a litmus test. Is that what are your thoughts?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that's one of the takeaways from this election cycle is, the NRA is going through all these struggles. It's still got the court case in New York that could see its leadership get tossed out of the organization over the corruption charges. And there's a lot of talk, as I alluded to earlier in our conversation here, about the influence of the NRA and how important it is. And if they want to maintain that level of influence they've had in previous decades, they're going to have to show people that they can still influence elections, that they can still spend money and get candidates elected or defeat their opponents. So how this election turns out, how these races are perceived to have been affected by the NRA's efforts will matter a lot for the organization going forward, right? And so, I think it's high stakes for them. They have to perform well in this election, or it's another negative mark in a series that's happened over the last several years.
Yeah, I've gotten some offline comments of people that have listened to the podcast and to this segment, and I think people get the impression that we're just here hurling stones at the NRA all the time. Well, the fact is, as we alluded to earlier, if the NRA goes away, if the NRA ceases to be as influential and large as it is, that's a real problem for the supporters of the Second Amendment, because there's no other organization that goes anywhere near its size or its influence and its history. So we don't want the NRA to fail. We would like to see some changes, especially at the top of the NRA. And we talked about that in previous episodes, how hard it is to end up in the position where you could become the next Wayne LaPierre. It's almost impossible, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is just about talking about the reality of where the NRA is at. I don't think it helps anyone to sugarcoat this stuff, right, or to pretend like it's not happening, or to pretend like the NRA is doing great right now, because they're not. And, so this is an important test for them. At the same time, I don't think it's sensible to go out and pretend that they are completely, lost and have no influence or don't matter, or it wouldn't matter if they went away tomorrow. Like, none of that is true either.
Right.
The organization is still by far the largest in the country dealing with guns by any measure. And, as much as you can look at some of the other pro-gun groups and say they've grown, or their influence has increased, and there's all these attempts to fill this vacuum created by the shrinking of the NRA, none of them come close to matching the size or funding or influence of the NRA. It's just the NRA has its fingers in every level of guns policy across this country, whether it's the legal front, the political front,
training,
or the training front. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. Like, the NRA is not something you're going to be able to replace tomorrow if it goes away. And I think that honestly more often is what I hear from gun rights activists. There's a difference between, of course, activists and just your regular gun owner. Mm-hmm. But more often I'm hearing that basically an apathy about the NRA situation they're in. We talked about, I believe, their convention that they held in Texas earlier this year, mm-hmm, and how, it was the smallest one since 2006. And, there were only like 500 people voted in the 76th board member election. And it's all these negative things that came out of that conference for them, negative headlines, negative facts. But at the same time, no other gun group on this planet could even hope to put together a convention like that. That's the reality of the situation with the NRA. It's like, you're seeing this shrinking, you're seeing the finances struggle, you're seeing, and this is true for the political spending as well. It's down compared to previous years. It just is. I mean, they spent nearly $50 million in 2016. Now, that was presidential elections. So this is a midterm. It's a little different, although the 2020, their spending was way down, like half of what it was in 2016. So, it's shrinking on this front too. But it's, again, as I mentioned, still way more than anyone else out there on the pro-gun side, and still more than the gun control side put together at this point.
Yeah, folks, if you want more on this, go head over to thereload.com. The article is by Jake Fogelman, and it is it's really well written, and it is chock full of, I think, pull quotes from all these various ads, so you can kind of go to that one spot and see what everyone's saying on all these different races, or see what the NRA is saying about these different races. And do me a favor, go over to thereload.com and carefully consider getting a membership. I got to tell you, folks, I stopped watching the regular news a while ago because I couldn't take it anymore, just for my own mental health. So the only news I get about the gun issues comes from the Reload, and I feel like I'm getting stuff that probably you're not getting anywhere else. So Stephen needs your membership dollars to continue his important work. Head over there to thereload.com, check it out, consider getting a membership. We appreciate it. And Stephen, we appreciate you coming on every week, and we'll see you next week, my friend.
Absolutely.
Hey friends, this is John Correa. If you like the podcast, if it is bringing you value, do me a favor and leave us a rating and a review. It really helps us out.